It's an honour to introduce Professor Jim Mann. I remember Professor Jim Mann at the University of Otago as a wonderful professor who spoke so true and honestly about nutrition. You could tell that this was something that a man had devoted a lifetime's work to. And he also fascinated me with his accent. Jim Mann has been Professor in Human Nutrition and Medicine at the University of Otago and consultant physician in Dunedin Hospital for the past 29 years. So he's got to know something about something to do with nutrition. He's a member of the Heart Foundation's board, director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Human Nutrition, the Edgar Diabetes and Obesity Research Centre at the University of Otago, the Healthier Lives National Science Challenge and New Zealand-China Non-Communicable Diseases Research Collaboration Centre. See why I had to take a breath for that. And he is also the principal investigator for the Riddett Institute, a national centre of research excellence at Massey University. Today, Jim, you're going to share some ideas on what exactly constitutes evidence for making nutrition recommendations. Ho mai te paki paki.
Kia ora, Lene. I always think people should be introduced after they've given a talk, because a couple of years ago I was at a big international diabetes meeting and a very well-known professor was introduced. And he was so famous and he was so renowned for his talk, his ability to give talks. And he gave the most shocking talk that you've ever heard. So really I think one should save that for afterwards. Anyway, you didn't, but thank you. I would just like to, before I start, really say what a great privilege it is to be here at the New Look ANA. I have, of course, known the ANA since it first started, but I would really like to wish Marthi and all those involved with ANA the very best wishes. I would also like to tell you, because I guess not many people know, that we are in the presence today of somebody who I think really conceived the ANA. And I don't know how many people here actually know that Boyd, who may or may not be in the room, was really the mastermind behind the ANA. There was opposition to the formation of the ANA, but Boyd's really persevered. And it's largely thanks to him. He was supported by lots of other people. Heather Fear, I think, was one person whose name comes to mind. But it really is great to just remember those that have actually been responsible for the fact that we are here today. I take great delight, really, in seeing the positive vibes that have come through today. I could be pessimistic. I've told a number of people that I was involved in nutrition recommendations for obesity in 1976 of the Royal College of Physicians, which said, it started off with a statement, if we don't do something about this epidemic which is about to happen, it will take over the world. I paraphrase, of course, not quite in those words. And we ignored that. I can remember, it was very interesting to hear what Albie had to say. I can remember talking in the early 1990s to Dr. Pat in Tolaga Bay and talking about what needed to be done. And we said, oh my goodness, we'd better do something. And here we still are. But I really think that when I sat here today and I sensed the energy that was coming forward, I really felt a lot more positive. Anyway, that's not what I meant to be talking about. What I am meant to be talking about is how do we come up with nutrition recommendations? How does evidence-based medicine, which is what we are told is essential for clinical medical practice, help us with making evidence-based nutrition recommendations? It's relatively easy in clinical medicine to come up with evidence-based recommendations, and there's a very standard process for doing so, which is entirely based, whatever process you use, on randomized controlled trials and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. It's easy, relatively, when you are studying a pill or some kind of medical treatment you have a group that's randomized into the pill, a placebo control, and you look and see who lives and dies and who gets coronaries and cancer and all the rest of it. And this is an example of statin drugs, not entirely straightforward, but I'm not going to go into the pros and cons here. And you can see that pretty much if you put somebody on a statin drug, you will reduce the risk of dying by 20% over the next 5 to 10 years, relative risk of 0.83, and you'll reduce the risk of coronary heart disease and procedures that are used to treat coronary heart disease by about 30%. Relatively straightforward. We are still in some chaos about nutrition recommendations. I was in London in July of last year, and I was just intrigued. I picked up something that was on the front page of the Daily Mail. And you can see there it tells you that if you quit carbs and quit sugar, you'll feel fabulous and you'll stay slim for life. And so I thought it would be interesting to just look at the British newspapers in the week that I was in the UK on that particular occasion. And, I mean, there were 7 major claims, whether you read the Daily Mail in London or whether you read the London Times, so a wide spectrum of readership. There were this number of things which tell you not only about cutting carbs, but whether that there's an anything you like diet which helps you to lose weight, that you can have butter with impunity, but olive oil is good, is even better. And, I mean, we are in a right mess. These are all, by the way, written by world authorities on the subject of nutrition. It's interesting, actually, in the Irish Times of Thursday of last week, there was one of the best articles I've ever read in a public newspaper about sugar, written by a musician. And so, I mean, it was brilliant. And then it was basically said you should cut down radically on sugar, but sugar isn't quite the same as heroin, which I think we'd all subscribe to that sort of view. And believe it or not, it's really fascinating. Go and look up the Irish Times of Thursday of last week. And people wrote in complaining about this really very good article, which of course said the World Health Organization had it right. And of course I believe, as I helped to write the World Health Organization recommendation about sugar, of course they had it right. So I thought this musician was absolutely spot on. And people said he should stick to his knitting. What does he know about nutrition? So this is the kind of mess we're in with nutrition. And why? Well, it's really because it's much more difficult to do randomized controlled trials involving nutrition and to come up with the kind of evidence that everybody will accept. Boyd's mentioned this morning how difficult it was to have a control group. He wasn't talking about randomized controlled trials necessarily, but I mean a control group in nutrition, unless you're looking at the effect of fish oil or something, when you can give some people fish oil capsules or some people placebo capsules or some kind of antioxidant nutrient, then it's relatively easy to have a control group. But if you want to know what happens if you change the fat content of your diet or whatever, very difficult to have a control group. It's incredibly difficult to have long-term compliance. I'm working my way up from the bottom, only because Boyd started about controls. So I'm going to start off with that. But, I mean, getting people to follow their diet for 5, 10 or 15 years, which is necessary to do a randomized controlled trial, as everybody knows, is enormously difficult. And, of course, nutritional factors which cause disease have been present for an incredibly long time. So if we come along and we change somebody's diet after being exposed to a particular kind of diet for most of their life, even if we show no benefit of that diet in a randomized controlled trial, it may be the wrong answer. The first 2 issues on that slide apply to, of course, all situations with regard to particularly chronic disease, which is largely what we are concerned about when we make nutrition recommendations, whether we're talking about obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, or diabetes. Now, we have in nutrition, as we do in medicine generally, a large number of research approaches which we can use to study nutrient disease and relationships. And I think, as you can see, actually I have got this pointed, I think it's got a new battery and so it works now. The ultimate way of studying disease-nutrient relationships is, of course, still with a randomized controlled trial, if we can do a randomized controlled trial, or better still, a meta-analysis. But I think my major message, and I'll give you my punchline now, as well as at the end in 15, 20 minutes from now, is my punchline is that almost always in nutrition, we've got to use the whole body of evidence to come up with a sensible recommendation. We've got to use the totality of evidence. And where we start to go wrong is if we draw conclusions from looking at disease trends over time and food consumption or cross-country comparisons, or indeed any one of these forms, or in particular, even any one study, such as a cohort study, which, as you see, gets 2 pluses. So it's the overall picture that we have to look at. And I'm really going to just give you 2 examples in my talk today, which really shows you how easy it is to go wrong and what we should do in order to try and keep things on the straight and narrow and come up with reasonable, definitive conclusions. Now, I think that there really is no option, but we have got to buy in to a single approach to generate evidence-based recommendations. The first attempt to come up with nutrition-based recommendations in a sort of organized kind of way actually came from the World Cancer Research Fund, that really tried to look at how confident that you could be about a relationship between a nutrient and disease being true, and if you were confident, how do you make a recommendation concerning that particular nutrient or that particular food. There probably are some of you who might just remember how nutrition recommendations were made before that. And I was involved mainly in Britain a very long time ago. I've lived in New Zealand, as you heard, for 30 years in New Zealand, certainly very much my home, but I was involved in this even before I came to New Zealand. And it was fascinating to be part of making nutrition recommendations because they were all very famous professors. And in those days, professors really, people, were very respectful. It's not like now. People were very respectful to professors, and if professors said something, people thought it must be right. And these guys were assembled together in a room, and basically everybody expressed their very strong opinion. They thought about it, and those who had the loudest voice won, generally. And that was the way nutrition recommendations and most recommendations were being made. Even in the 1980s, people were doing that kind of thing. But the WCRF, the World Cancer Research Fund, really put together this, and I'm not going to give you a lecture on how this actually works, but basically they said there are either convincing or probable associations which could translate into recommendations. And basically, you needed a randomized controlled trial to come up with a convincing recommendation, and or a probable recommendation could be based on cohort studies, if there was a dose response in terms of the association, and then also if there were mechanistic studies which back this up. And really, this worked reasonably well for cancer, and it was adopted by the World Health Organization. Boyd and I were involved in, I think, the first time the World Health Organization used this in the early 2000s to actually come up in general with nutrient and food type recommendations. And in fact, even beyond nutrient and food, it was in terms of what people could do to try and implement these. But I'm not going to go through all the different approaches which have been suggested subsequently, but the approach that is really recommended by the World Health Organization now, and I would suggest should be used by everyone, is GRADE. GRADE is not perfect, but GRADE is not only what is being used at WHO, but what is increasingly used by national, international organizations. And it can work for nutrition, as we showed in the case of sugar. And I'm not going to go into the sugar recommendations in any detail, but really just use this to show you that the first thing you do with GRADE is you do a very, very careful assessment of the existing literature, particularly the randomized controlled trials where they exist, but you can use other types of studies that I showed you, and you decide on the quality of the literature and the importance of the finding, as well as the effect. In this case, you can see here that free sugars at a certain level were associated, if you reduce them, with a 20% reduction in in body fatness, in body weight. So this was really one of the approaches that was used for WHO recommendations. But at the end of the day, you can still use your expertise, knowledge of other information that you have, to come up with a recommendation which is either convincing or strong or conditional. And a convincing or strong recommendation, according to grade, means a country or a group should implement that recommendation. If they don't, it's at their peril. The conditional recommendation is that a country or a group should look very seriously at implementing that recommendation and do so unless there's a very good reason for not doing so. Now, I know that there's a whole range of other approaches. There's SIGN. There are other approaches which produce a grade A or a grade B or a grade C. And I think that's been useful and helpful in some situations, but I would like to suggest that we should stop that approach now. It's very confusing to talk about grade A, because grade is now a system for making recommendation, and I think we need to move to using this, as do most other bodies worldwide. So nutrition recommendations, I say this I think just twice more, so really to make my point, must consider the totality of evidence, ranging from what happens in the laboratory to what happens with populations. We need to consider everything across the board. So I said I was going to give you two examples. The first one relates to cardiovascular disease, and the second is going to relate to colorectal cancer in meat, which is very topical, just in terms of publications that have come out recently. And of course, this just shows what happens to the coronary artery when it gets blocked by atheroma. Now, one of the real difficulties that we have with coronary heart disease, as indeed we have with non-communicable disease generally in relation to nutrition, is, of course, we've got this whole range of risk factors. And coronary heart disease, which is still the biggest killer, we need to remember, although rates are coming down, so it's still very important, but in particular has a substantial number of potentially modifiable risk factors. And the key aspect of nutrition that I'm going to talk about, which seems to remain controversial, is whether or not saturated fat is an important determinant of coronary heart disease, and whether saturated fat reduction should be an important nutritional bit of advice. So let's just look at how things can go wrong. Really just a reminder before I start to summarize the literature is that, of course, there are a number of different sources of saturated fat which are very different. I mean, fatty meat is different from butter, different from milk, different from cheese, and very different from coconuts. So we need to have that at the back of our minds. Now, this paper was published in the BMJ. Russell D'Souza published a paper looking at the cohort studies relating saturated fat to coronary heart disease. And what he showed was that if you look at whether saturated fats are protective or whether saturated fats are harmful, there is really nothing here that is remotely statistically significant. There's actually some findings about diabetes which look most significant. But basically, there are things on both sides of the line, and well, you can't summarize them and draw a diamond, as Boyd showed you, because these are looking at different kinds of conditions. But it looks as if saturated fat is neutral in these cohort studies. Well, that was a wonderful evidence for people who wanted to say you can eat saturated fat with impunity. Just remember this, and we'll come back to it. So one particular study. The study that the people who felt that saturated fat was fine absolutely loved was the so-called Women's Health Study, the Women's Health Initiative, which really looked to see if radical reduction of saturated and total fat could reduce the risk of cancer, breast cancer, but also whether it could, they looked in this particular paper, at whether it could reduce the risk of coronary heart disease and stroke. Because obviously, if fat's going to be down to this level, saturated fat is going to be radically reduced, which it was. And oh, joy of joys, if you like saturated fat, you can see that people who were in the intervention group, that is, were told to reduce the saturated fat, people in the comparison group had exactly the same risk of myocardial infarction, coronary heart disease, death, or treatment for blockage of the coronary arteries as did the intervention group. So you look at individual studies and you get wonderful evidence for whatever point you want to make. But let's now look at the totality of evidence and see if we can explain this phenomenon. So obviously, if you're interested in saturated fat, cholesterol becomes pivotal, and I think everybody knows this incredibly striking relationship. This is total cholesterol. You can draw the same pictures for LDL cholesterol. This absolutely linear relationship between risk of heart disease and cholesterol or LDL cholesterol levels. Next bit of, remember I said you can look at experimental evidence as well. Again, this has been demonstrated repeatedly. Replacing 5% total energy from saturated fat with carbohydrate reduces LDL a little bit. With monounsaturated fat, reduces it a bit more. Reduces it with change it with polyunsaturated fat, and you get the biggest reduction of the lot. If you use trans fat, it goes up, but we're not going to talk about trans fat today. So, what happens then if you look at an aggregation of the randomized controlled trials? Well, Lee Hooper published this, looked at all the clinical trials that compared saturated fat reduction with a usual diet, so saturated fat with anything else in the diet. And as you can see here from this aggregated diamond, about a 17% significant reduction in coronary heart disease events. Very consistent trend here, though, of course, variation, because many of these trials were small. They had quite wide confidence intervals. Well, said the critics, but this was only cardiovascular disease. This wasn't death. Death rates were not reduced by reducing saturated fat. Well, what they didn't point out was that these studies were relatively short and they were never intended to look at mortality. They were only intended to look at morbidity. Very interesting to look at this a bit more. If you replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, you get a 24% reduction in coronary heart disease. If you look at replacement with carbohydrate, no reduction. And if you look at monounsaturated fat replacement, it comes a bit of a surprise. It looks as if it increases the risk. But in fact, there was only 2 trials that did this, and there were problems with those trials, so really this doesn't tell you anything. But what it tells you is replacing polyunsaturated fat, use it as a replacement for saturated, significant reduction, carbohydrate, no reduction. Another interesting finding, if you look at people who didn't reduce their cholesterol very much, in other words, they didn't comply with a diet, no benefit. When they reduced their cholesterol quite a lot, quite a substantial benefit. So you can see as we're going along, this whole question becomes very different when you look at the totality of evidence. Now, we can just skip that one, that's just kind of repeating. But now things get even more interesting, because you remember I showed you, you probably don't remember, but try, that when you looked at the cohort studies, a paper published by Russell D'Souza, he found no difference between high and low saturated fat. Well, have a look at this particular study, which looked at the alternative to saturated fat, also in cohort studies. When you look at the alternative to saturated fat, you can, as being polyunsaturated fat, here you have got, again, your roughly 20 to 30% reduction. When you look at carbohydrate replacing saturated fat, there's absolutely no benefit. You see some sort of consistency starts to emerge. What people who hailed Russell D'Souza's study didn't mention, they probably didn't read the paper, was that Russell D'Souza very clearly said in his paper that his findings could have been due to this particular phenomenon, the type of replacement for saturated fat. Remember the Women's Health Initiative, which really should have shown a reduction in coronary heart disease? Well, there were some people in the Women's Health Initiative who decreased their LDL cholesterol quite a lot, who followed their diet. There were some who, I haven't got here the ones who didn't, But these ones who reduced their LDL cholesterol, in fact, they significantly reduced their coronary heart disease. It was just that an awful lot of women in the Women's Health Initiative just found that thing so daunting to decrease their total fat down to 20%, they never did it. So, order in the universe. The final slide I want to show you in this sequence is the one that I find very interesting, comes from the Nurses' Health Study, and I think the Nurses' Health Study combined with a health professional study, which is the very big Harvard cohort study following male and female health professionals with very good dietary data and looking to see how what they ate or whether they changed their diet related to subsequent heart disease, cancer, and everything else. And I find this particularly interesting. Just concentrate on the top half of this slide and look what happens when you replace saturated fat with trans fat. You can see change in risk. If you put trans fat, things get even worse than saturated fat. Monounsaturated fat, big study, you get considerable benefit. Polyunsaturated fat replacement, even more of a benefit. Carbohydrate from refined starches or added sugars as a replacement gets a little bit worse. But carbohydrates from whole grains actually gets quite a lot better. So if you put this whole story together, what you are really showing is an enormous body of evidence from experiments, from randomized controlled trials, from cohort studies, that really brings a lot of order into the universe, which says reduce saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, with some monounsaturated fat, or with the right kind of carbohydrates, not these nasty refined starches or added sugars, and you seem to get an overall benefit. The totality of the evidence is very strong. Deaths from heart disease and other causes in New Zealand. Everybody knows heart disease has coming down, went up dramatically from about the late 1940s, 50s to the 70s, since which it's come down dramatically. This is not entirely due to saturated fat. Reduction in smoking is terribly important, but this is totally consistent with the nutritional changes as well as other lifestyle changes which have occurred. So, WHO felt, the WHO findings have not actually been published yet in terms of saturated fat, but the grade profile based on the Hooper study and the rest of the totality of evidence suggests that reducing saturated fat, replacing with polyunsaturated fat, this doesn't mean you can't have some other replacement, is associated with a nearly 30% reduction in cardiovascular events. The quality of the evidence is regarded as moderate, the importance is critical, and the grade profile is summarized here. This now needs to be translated into a recommendation which will almost certainly qualifies as a strong recommendation to replace some of the saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. So really that is the kind of data which is behind some of the newer recommendations. WHO 2003 is a bit old now and will be replaced, but the most modern ones are the Nordic recommendations, which says whatever you do here, reduce your saturated fat to less than 10%, but it does actually recommend, interestingly, that you can have a wide range of total fat because polys are okay, monos are okay, trans should be kept as low as possible. But of course, one of the things that needs to be taken into account, and I'm not going to go there for the moment, is, of course, that a high fat intake can be a promoter of obesity, so you might want to take that into account in populations that have a predisposition to obesity. So that really is how we can use existing science, even though none of the studies are perfect, to develop recommendations for which we can be very confident. And all the problems that have occurred has happened as a consequence of individuals or groups taking things out of context, using a single approach or a single study to come up with a misrepresentation of the science. I don't know how we stop that, but that, I think, goes beyond my brief for today. I'm just going to end off by showing you perhaps the current example, which has happened with red meat. Sorry, I did want to say one more thing just before I finally leave this topic. New data comes in all the time. And there is some evidence which suggests that the different sources of saturated fat may not be all the same. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that coconuts are the great thing. You can have as much saturated fat from coconut oil as you like. The data for coconut oil is very limited, other than I'm told that it's very good for the skin. So I don't wish to denigrate the beauty value of coconut oil. But certainly anybody who wishes to use coconut oil as a healthy oil is misguided. Because, again, there's no evidence that coconut oil is actually good for you or that it's better for you than something else. It may turn out to be, and it may well be that amongst these different sources of saturated fat, that some are better than others. But for the moment, the totality of evidence, and I hope I've convinced you there's quite a lot of it, says reduce saturated fat. Well, maybe it will change, but that is what the evidence shows right now. Enough on saturated fat. Let's just talk about meat. And I just want to use this example because it's been in the news a lot. The British Medical Journal published this paper just 2 weeks ago, I think it was. And red meat consumption is linked to a higher risk of death from most major causes. And this was the sort of teaser in the BMJ, and it referred to this paper, mortality from different causes associated with meat, and look at hemine, nitrates, and nitrites in this particular study in the United States, which involved over 500,000 people. Quite a lot of people to study. And what they came up with in this study was, and I'm sorry, the bottom seems to have been cut off this slide, but what this really shows is that this line here is 1. So anything that appears on this side of the line suggests that it's bad for you. On this side of the line suggests it's good for you. So that's worse, that's better. And what you can see here is that this particular study shows that total red meat, processed meat, unprocessed meat, in excess amounts. By the way, I'm not saying that anybody should never eat red meat any more than I've said anybody should never eat saturated fat. This is not what these data or any other data show. But you can see there's a very consistent pattern here for all causes of death, cancer and heart disease for these different categories. White meat on the other side seems to come largely on this side of the line. And when one looks at hemine intake, nitrate or nitrite for, again, these different categories, again, it's all on the wrong side of the line. Well, John Potter, who is Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Health, wrote an editorial in the BMJ really drawing attention to the findings and really talking about some of the ecological findings in relation to red meat and processed meat. Well, I don't know if you read the social media, not just in New Zealand, but many countries. There was an outroar, an absolute outcry. This is a cohort study. We all know that there are problems of cohort studies. This study is flawed, and it's a fascinating saga if you want to go and read the whole saga around this particular paper. I emphasize that this paper, and even John Potter's commentary, said that you should not eat red or processed meat. It simply talked about association and the implication being that quantities should be reduced. It completely ignored that the World Cancer Research Fund had done an update on red meat and colorectal cancer in 2011. There's another one about to come out. And there was an amazingly consistent finding going in the same direction. There was a large body of supplementary experimental evidence which led the World Cancer Research Fund to conclude that red and processed meat, together with alcohol, together with obesity, were factors which increased the risk. Physical activity, dietary fiber decreased the risk. And it is yet another example of taking one study out of context of the totality of the evidence to criticize the findings. And again, I say Somebody said to me, I frequently get accused when I give talks like this of saying, how can you say you shouldn't eat red meat? Red meat is a wonderful source of iron and all the rest of it. That is not what one's saying here. Nobody has actually made that recommendation. The recommendation is based on the data itself, which suggests that a high intake of red and processed meat, in the same way that a high intake of saturated fat might be disadvantageous to human health. So, I'm sure you know everything that I've just said. I haven't told you anything you don't know. But I guess my plea to this particular group is to really use your influence when people come out with criticisms of what is based on really incredibly hard science, to remind those people, to remind those with whom you come into contact, that actually for every nutritional recommendation that's currently being made, there really has been a very carefully considered opinion behind the recommendation that's been made, and encouraging people to look at this question of totality of evidence. And it's interesting, isn't it, that even musicians sometimes can be better than so-called self-confessed scientists. And I didn't bring, my punchline has been lost, because in my bag I've got the final quote from this wonderful Irish Times article, which basically says, isn't it surprising, experts are actually quite often right. You should take their advice and not those of Egypts. And Egypts are defined, and if you want to know what Egypts are, look at the Irish Times of last week. So I think that's enough. I think I've left 5 or 6 minutes for questions, and I hope there'll be some discussion.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have a burning question for Professor Jim? I know, it's like, what on earth could I ask Professor Jim Mann?
This agreement would be equally interesting, more interesting.
Did I see a hand? Yes, we have a hand right at the back. And a microphone is coming your way so that you don't have to strain your voice.
Who is doing all these studies? Who is producing them? I had some figure of something like 680 studies a day coming out for us workers to have a look at. How can we have some sort of system that helps us to get studies that are going to be useful rather than just prolific?
Yeah. I think that's a very important question. The answer to who is doing the studies, I mean, you have researchers worldwide working in laboratories or amongst populations who are doing those studies. You are absolutely right. In terms of interpreting them and analyzing them, it is a major task, and there are bodies around the world that are set up to do just that. We rely very heavily on the World Health Organization. There are bodies in any number of countries, including our own, whose job it is to interpret the findings of these studies and who use the systems that I've described, or some comparable systems. I mean, GRADE, I've suggested, is the new system which has been very widely accepted. But, I mean, we have in New Zealand used other approaches, come up with Grade A and Grade B recommendations, defined quite similarly. I was just making a plea that we should all use the same system, and I think we are moving in that direction. Boyd is going to...
Thank you very much, Jim, for a great presentation, and it is a big challenge, isn't it, to pull this evidence together for each of these recommendations. And the tendency, I guess, is to focus on the nutrients, and we've kind of come from a nutrient space, and now we're trying to get into foods, even though when it turns out in the dietary guidelines or recommendations, the things that we should eat more of are easily converted into foods and recommendations around food. We should eat less of the saturated fat, the sugar, the salt tend to stay as nutrients. So there's that kind of tension, I guess, in converting them into recommendations. But can you also talk about dietary patterns and how dietary patterns fits into this evidence?
Yeah, thanks, Boyd. Dietary patterns are very important, and interestingly, you may be interested here, in fact, you probably know that WHO is turning its attention to dietary patterns. The American guidelines have put a lot of effort into dietary patterns. 2 points to make about dietary patterns. One is the science in terms of disentangling these dietary patterns is much more difficult. It's difficult enough to talk about saturated fat or red meat, whether it's a food or a nutrient. But when you come to talking about the Mediterranean diet, there isn't one such thing as a Mediterranean diet. I think the answer lies in the fact that you need both. You need to give advice. You can give advice about dietary patterns, but you need to take the actual foods or nutrients into account as well. For example, I mean, there are many countries now where a Mediterranean type of diet can be totally abused. I mean, you can have a high saturated fat Mediterranean diet depending on how you prepare your Mediterranean diet. So I think we're moving into the era of trying to say there is a range of acceptable dietary patterns. I mean, you can have a relatively low carbohydrate dietary pattern that has got very good health outcomes, and you can have a very high carbohydrate dietary pattern that has got relatively good outcomes, but it depends on what goes on in those dietary patterns. So the high carbohydrate dietary pattern should not include sugar and rapidly digested starches. So I think that you need to have both. And I think with both, we'll be able to be even more confident than we are now of our nutritional recommendations. And I think it is important that we be confident in what we say, because we can actually be quite confident in our current nutritional guidelines.
Any other thoughts?
About sustainability, why we haven't got sustainability in our dietary guidelines?
Well, I can tell you that in WHO, I mean, my current involvement is with WHO guidelines at the moment, although, of course, I've been involved with guidelines in New Zealand. But sustainability is a feature that needs to be taken into account. And so if you're going to make a recommendation that everybody should eat fish 5 times a week, you've got to think twice about doing that, because you can't make a recommendation that the world should eat fish 5 times a week. There wouldn't be any fish left. So it is, and I think it should increasingly be so. And I think that's what John Potter was saying in his editorial, which copped a certain amount of flack. I think they've had enough.
I think that was a pretty awesome answer. Thank you very much, Jim.